The Washington Territory winter of 1892 unleashed a fury unlike anything the Olympic Peninsula had witnessed in living memory. Gale-force winds screamed across the Strait of Juan to Fuca, driving mountainous waves against the rocky coastline, with such violence that the earth trembled beneath Sarah Mitchell's boots. The Makah elders spoke in hushed tones of storms that could swallow entire villages. Yet here at Windward Ridge Ranch, perched precariously on the cliffs above Neah Bay, an impossible calm settled over the land like a protective embrace. Sarah stood at the edge of Thunder Point, her weathered hands gripping the ancient whalebone staff that had belonged to her late husband's Makah grandmother. Below her, the Pacific Ocean raged with supernatural intensity, yet not a single drop of rain touched her face. The wind that should have torn her from the cliff face seemed to part around her like water around the bow of a ship. For 3 days now, the most devastating storm in territorial history had battered every ranch and settlement for hundreds of miles. Yet her cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that remained inexplicably untouched by nature's wrath. The impossible phenomenon had begun with the whale song she sang each dawn, ancient Makah prayers taught to her by Joseph Running Bear in the desperate months after her husband's death. What had started as a widow's attempt to find solace in spiritual tradition had somehow become something far more extraordinary. As word spread of the ranch that storms could not touch, visitors arrived from across the territory seeking answers, shelter, and perhaps miracles. Yet Sarah herself understood neither the source of her gift nor the terrible responsibility it carried, only that her children remained safe while the world beyond her boundaries faced nature's unrelenting assault. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had never intended to become a frontier woman, much less one whose very existence would challenge everything the settlers of the Olympic Peninsula believed about the natural world. Just 18 months earlier, she had been the wife of Daniel Mitchell, a respected cattle rancher whose operation supplied beef to the growing settlements of Port Angeles and Seattle. Their life at Windward Ridge Ranch had been one of hard work and simple contentment, raising their 2 children while building something lasting on the wild coastline of the Washington Territory. The ranch itself occupied one of the most precarious locations imaginable, perched on coastal cliffs where the Pacific Ocean met the dense evergreen forests of the Olympic Mountains. Daniel had chosen the site not for its safety, but for its strategic value. The natural harbor below provided access to shipping routes, while the elevated position offered protection from the flooding that plagued lower-lying ranches during the region's notorious winter storms. The Makah people, whose reservation bordered their property, had warned Daniel that the location carried spiritual significance, but like most white settlers of his generation, he had dismissed such concerns as primitive superstition. The transformation in Sarah's understanding began with tragedy, as profound changes often do. Daniel's death had come without warning during the previous spring's cattle drive to Port Angeles. A spooked steer had charged directly at 8-year-old Tommy, who had frozen in terror at the sight of the massive animal bearing down on him. Daniel threw himself between his son and certain death, successfully pushing the boy to safety, but taking the full impact of the steer's charge. The injury to his spine was catastrophic, and despite Sarah's desperate attempts to care for him, he died 3 days later in their ranch house bedroom, his final words a whispered apology for leaving her alone with such an impossible burden. The months following Daniel's funeral had tested every aspect of Sarah's character. The ranch required constant attention, from maintaining the cattle herd to repairing fences damaged by coastal storms. Their nearest neighbors, the Stevens family, lived more than 10 miles away across treacherous terrain, making regular assistance impossible. The children, Tommy and 4-year-old Emma, struggled with their father's absence while depending entirely on their mother for both emotional support and physical survival. Sarah's own grief threatened to overwhelm her capacity to function, Yet she pressed forward each day because the alternative meant losing everything Daniel had worked to build. Financial pressures compounded the emotional burden. Daniel's death had coincided with a territorial economic downturn that drastically reduced the demand for beef. The mortgage payments on their land, manageable when Daniel's experience commanded premium prices for their cattle, became increasingly difficult to meet on Sarah's inexperienced efforts alone. Government land agent Samuel Price had begun making regular visits to the ranch, ostensibly to check on the widow's welfare, but clearly assessing whether foreclosure proceedings might soon be necessary. His barely concealed eagerness to reclaim the valuable coastal property for resale to more established ranchers added urgency to Sarah's desperate situation. It was during this period of mounting crisis that Joseph Running Bear first appeared. At Sarah's door, the elderly Makah elder had been Daniel's occasional trading partner, exchanging traditional knowledge about coastal weather patterns for access to the ranch's freshwater spring during dry summers. His arrival on that gray October morning had initially seemed like another burden Sarah could barely afford to acknowledge. Her relationship with the neighboring Makah community had always been cordial but distant, mediated entirely through Daniel's more outgoing personality and business acumen. Joseph's weathered face carried the dignity of a man who had witnessed the transformation of his people's ancestral lands into territorial settlements, yet his dark eyes held a gentleness that immediately put Sarah at ease. He explained that he had come to honor a debt of gratitude to Daniel, who had once provided shelter to Joseph's family during a particularly severe winter storm when other white settlers had turned them away. The spiritual traditions of his people required that such debts be repaid to the deceased's family, and he wished to offer Sarah knowledge that might help her maintain the ranch and care for her children. The knowledge Joseph offered seemed almost ridiculously impractical at first. He spoke of ancient Makah whale prayers, spiritual songs that his ancestors had used to communicate with the great sea creatures that formed the foundation of tribal life. These prayers, he explained, were believed to carry power over the ocean's moods, calming storms and calling favorable winds. To Sarah's practical mind, focused on cattle prices and mortgage payments, such spiritual practices seemed irrelevant to her immediate needs. Yet something in Joseph's earnest demeanor and her own desperate circumstances made her willing to listen. Joseph's initial visits followed a careful pattern, designed to respect both tribal traditions and Sarah's obvious discomfort with unfamiliar spiritual practices. He would arrive at dawn, when the children were still sleeping and Sarah's morning chores provided natural opportunities for conversation. As she milked their small dairy herd or gathered eggs from the chicken coop, Joseph would share stories of his people's relationship with the coastal environment. These tales were not presented as mystical beliefs, but as practical knowledge, accumulated over generations of life, dependent on understanding natural patterns. The whale prayers themselves were introduced gradually, first as cultural education rather than spiritual practice. Joseph explained that the Makah people had developed these songs over centuries of whale hunting, learning to read the ocean's moods and predict weather changes that could mean the difference between successful hunts and tragic losses of life. The prayers served multiple purposes. They helped hunters maintain courage during dangerous ocean voyages, provided a framework for remembering crucial navigation information, and created spiritual connection with the marine environment that sustained tribal life. Sarah's initial attempts to learn the prayers felt awkward and self-conscious. The Makah language carried sounds and rhythms completely foreign to her English-speaking tongue, while the spiritual concepts challenged her Presbyterian upbringing's emphasis on more conventional forms of worship. Joseph proved to be a patient teacher, never pushing her beyond her comfort level, but always encouraging her to approach the practices with an open mind. He emphasized that the prayers were not requests for supernatural intervention, but rather expressions of harmony with natural forces that surrounded the ranch. The first signs of something extraordinary occurred during November's notorious coastal storms. Sarah had begun incorporating simplified versions of the whale prayers into her morning routine, singing them softly while performing chores around the ranch buildings. The songs provided a meditative quality to her work that helped manage the stress of her overwhelming responsibilities. She noticed that her anxiety seemed to diminish when she focused on the rhythmic patterns of the ancient melodies, though she attributed this to the calming effect of any repetitive activity rather than anything mystical. November brought the first major storm system of the winter season, a Pacific cyclone that meteorologists in Seattle predicted would bring devastating winds and flooding to the entire Olympic Peninsula. Sarah prepared for the worst, moving the cattle to higher pastures and securing anything that might become dangerous projectiles in high winds. The Stevens family sent word that they were evacuating to Port Angeles until the storm passed, and they strongly encouraged Sarah to do the same. Her refusal to abandon the ranch seemed foolishly stubborn to her neighbors, but Sarah knew that leaving would likely mean returning to find her livelihood destroyed beyond recovery. The storm struck with precisely the fury that had been predicted, yet something impossible began to unfold at Windward Ridge Ranch. While winds exceeding 60 miles per hour stripped roofs from buildings throughout the peninsula and rainfall measured in feet rather than inches, Sarah's property remained eerily calm. The whale prayers she had sung that morning seemed to hang in the air around the ranch like an invisible barrier, deflecting the storm's worst effects. Her cattle remained placid in their pastures while neighboring ranches reported animals scattered across the countryside. The ranch buildings suffered no damage while structures just miles away were reduced to splinters. The phenomenon was so pronounced that Ben Carter, the ranch foreman who had stayed to help Sarah weather the storm, openly questioned whether they were experiencing the same weather system affecting the rest of the region. Standing on the covered porch of the main house while horizontal rain lashed the surrounding countryside, they could clearly see the storm's violence just beyond the ranch boundaries. Yet within the property lines, the rain fell gently and the wind barely stirred the evergreen branches. The effect was so dramatic that it seemed almost supernatural, though neither Sarah nor Ben possessed any framework for understanding what they were witnessing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word of the ranch's mysterious protection spread quickly through the sparsely populated peninsula. Martha Stevens, upon returning from Port Angeles after the storm, found her own property severely damaged while Sarah's remained untouched. Contrast was so stark that Martha initially assumed she had somehow become confused about property boundaries. When she realized that the damage pattern followed precise lines that corresponded to ranch ownership rather than geographical features, her skepticism gave way to uncomfortable questions about forces she could not explain. The local territorial government took notice when similar patterns repeated during subsequent storms throughout the winter. Government officials who dismissed individual accounts as exaggeration were forced to acknowledge the phenomenon when multiple independent witnesses reported identical observations. Samuel Price, the land agent who had been preparing foreclosure proceedings against Sarah's ranch, found himself in the uncomfortable position of documenting properties that seemed to possess inexplicable advantages over their neighbors. His reports to territorial authorities became increasingly cautious as he struggled to explain evidence that challenged conventional understanding of how weather systems functioned. Joseph Running Bear's reaction to the growing attention surprised Sarah with its mixture of pride and concern. During one of his regular visits, he explained that such manifestations of spiritual power were not unknown in Makah tradition, though they were considered both rare and potentially dangerous. The whale prayers, he revealed, were believed capable of creating harmony between human communities and the ocean's spiritual forces, but this harmony required careful maintenance and proper understanding of the responsibilities it entailed. Sarah's natural ability to access this power suggested a spiritual sensitivity that went beyond mere learning of traditional techniques. The responsibility aspect of Joseph's warnings proved prophetic as winter progressed and Sarah's situation became increasingly complex. Settlers from across the peninsula began arriving at Windward Ridge Ranch seeking shelter during severe weather, word having spread that her property offered protection unavailable elsewhere. Sarah found herself managing not just her own family and livestock, but also a steady stream of refugees from storms that seemed to target every location except her ranch. The additional mouths to feed and bodies to shelter strained her resources, while creating social dynamics she was unprepared to navigate. Some visitors arrived with genuine gratitude and willingness to contribute labor in exchange for protection, while others displayed attitudes of entitlement that tested Sarah's patience. Frank Harrison, a neighboring rancher whose property had suffered significant storm damage, arrived with demands rather than requests, insisting that Sarah's obvious access to supernatural protection obligated her to share it with established community members like himself. His dismissive attitude toward the Makah origins of her abilities, combined with his assumption that a widow should defer to male authority, created tensions that went beyond simple resource sharing. The winter of 1892 progressed with increasing intensity as Pacific storm systems seemed to target the Olympic Peninsula with unusual frequency and severity. Each storm brought new challenges to Sarah's expanding role as an unofficial refuge coordinator, while also demonstrating the remarkable consistency of her property's protection. The whale prayers had become a daily ritual that she performed with growing confidence and understanding, though the source of their power remained as mysterious as ever. Joseph's visits became more frequent as he helped Sarah develop deeper appreciation for the spiritual traditions she was accessing, while also warning her about the potential consequences of abilities that set her apart from both white and native communities. The children adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience typical of young people, though in distinctly different ways. Tommy, at 8 years old, had begun to understand that their family situation was unusual and potentially controversial. He listened carefully to adult conversations and asked increasingly sophisticated questions about the relationship between his mother's prayers and the protection they seemed to provide. Emma, only 4, accepted the constant presence of strangers and the family's growing reputation with the unquestioning adaptability of early childhood, though she had begun incorporating elements of Makah songs into her own play activities. As February arrived with a storm system that territorial meteorologists predicted would be the most severe of the season, Sarah faced a crisis that would test not only her mysterious abilities, but also her understanding of the responsibilities they carried. Dr. Catherine Wells, a traveling physician from Seattle, had arrived at the ranch seeking shelter, while traveling to provide medical care to isolated communities throughout the peninsula. Her presence would prove crucial as the approaching storm brought with it challenges that went far beyond mere weather protection, forcing Sarah to discover depths of her abilities that she had never suspected existed. The stage was set for a confrontation between spiritual forces and natural disasters that would transform not only Sarah's understanding of her place in the world, but also the relationship between the white settlers and indigenous peoples of the Olympic Peninsula. The whale prayers that had begun as a widow's desperate attempt to find meaning in tragedy were about to become the foundation for something far more significant than personal survival. The transformation that would eventually make Sarah Mitchell a legend throughout the Pacific Northwest had its roots in a childhood spent between two worlds, though she had never understood the significance of this duality until Joseph Running Bear began teaching her the whale prayers. Born Sarah Catherine Morrison in the frontier town of Olympia, she had grown up as the daughter of a territorial judge, whose progressive views on indigenous rights had shaped her early understanding of the complex relationships between settlers and native peoples. Her father, Judge William Morrison, had been one of the few white officials who consistently ruled in favor of treaty obligations when disputes arose between territorial authorities and tribal communities. This unusual upbringing had exposed Sarah to perspectives that most settler children never encountered. The Morrison household regularly hosted diplomatic meetings between territorial representatives and tribal leaders, conversations that young Sarah absorbed from her position on the staircase, where she would listen to negotiations that determined the fate of entire communities. Her father's insistence on treating indigenous representatives with the same respect accorded to white officials had been considered radical by many of his contemporaries, yet it provided Sarah with an early appreciation for the sophistication and wisdom of native cultures that would prove crucial decades later. The judge's progressive attitudes extended to his daughter's education, which included not only traditional academic subjects, but also practical skills that would serve her well on the frontier. Sarah learned to read and write at a level that surpassed most men of her generation, while also mastering the domestic arts that frontier women needed for survival. More unusually, her father encouraged her to participate in the political discussions that took place in their home, believing that women's perspectives were essential for creating just policies in the developing territory. This intellectual foundation would later enable Sarah to navigate the complex cultural negotiations required to bridge Makah's spiritual traditions with settler community needs. Her marriage to Daniel Mitchell had represented a departure from the cosmopolitan environment of her childhood toward the more isolated existence of ranch life. Daniel, the son of Irish immigrants who had arrived in the territory during the 1860s, possessed the practical skills and determined optimism necessary for successful frontier ranching. His family had established the original homestead at Windward Ridge through the kind of backbreaking labor that characterized pioneer life, clearing forest land and building the infrastructure necessary to support cattle operations in a region where everything had to be created from scratch. The courtship between Sarah and Daniel had been conducted through the formal social structures of territorial society, with meetings carefully chaperoned by family members and community leaders. Yet beneath the surface propriety, their relationship had been built on genuine intellectual compatibility and shared values that went beyond the economic considerations that motivated many frontier marriages. Daniel's respect for Sarah's education and opinions, unusual for men of his generation, had created a partnership that balanced traditional gender roles with mutual recognition of each other's capabilities and contributions. The early years of their marriage had been marked by the challenges typical of frontier ranch life, but also by a sense of shared purpose that sustained them through difficulties that might have broken less committed couples. Establishing a cattle operation on the Olympic Peninsula required not only agricultural knowledge, but also the ability to navigate relationships with indigenous communities whose traditional hunting and fishing grounds overlapped with ranch boundaries. Daniel's pragmatic approach to these negotiations, influenced by Sarah's childhood exposure to diplomatic processes, had resulted in generally positive relationships with neighboring Makah families. The birth of their children had deepened both the joys and responsibilities of ranch life. Tommy's arrival in 1884 had been followed by Emma's birth in 1888, creating a family dynamic that brought new meaning to their isolated existence while also increasing the stakes involved in every decision they made. Sarah's transition from territorial judge's daughter to frontier mother had required the development of skills her privileged upbringing had never anticipated, from delivering calves during difficult births to treating childhood illnesses without access to professional medical care. Daniel's relationship with the Makah community had evolved beyond mere business transactions to include genuine friendships that enriched their family's understanding of the natural environment surrounding their ranch. Joseph Running Bear had been among the most frequent visitors to their home, sharing knowledge about coastal weather patterns and wildlife, behavior that proved invaluable for successful ranching operations. These exchanges had introduced Sarah to aspects of indigenous culture that her father's diplomatic exposure had only hinted at, revealing the depth and sophistication of traditional ecological knowledge that had sustained native communities for centuries. The spiritual dimensions of Makah culture had remained largely mysterious to Sarah during her husband's lifetime, respected but not deeply understood. Daniel's practical orientation had focused primarily on the utilitarian aspects of indigenous knowledge, appreciating traditional weather prediction techniques and wildlife management practices while remaining somewhat skeptical of their spiritual foundations. Sarah had participated in these cultural exchanges as a supportive wife rather than an independent seeker, content to let Daniel manage the complexities of cross-cultural relationships while she focused on domestic responsibilities. The economic foundation of their ranch operation had been built on Daniel's innovative approach to cattle breeding and his shrewd understanding of territorial market dynamics. Rather than competing directly with larger operations closer to major population centers, he had focused on developing premium beef products that commanded higher prices from discriminating customers in Seattle and other growing cities. This strategy required maintaining smaller herds of superior quality animals rather than pursuing the volume-based approach favored by many ranchers, but it had proven financially successful while also being more compatible with the environmental constraints of coastal ranching. The ranch infrastructure that Daniel had developed over nearly a decade of operation reflected both practical necessity and aesthetic sensibility. The main house, built from locally harvested cedar logs, had been designed to withstand the coastal storms that regularly tested peninsula structures, while also providing comfort and beauty for family life. The barn and outbuildings followed similar principles, combining functional efficiency with craftsmanship that reflected Daniel's Irish heritage and pride in creating something lasting for future generations. The social isolation inherent in their ranch location had been both blessing and burden during the marriage years. While the distance from neighbors provided privacy and independence that both Sarah and Daniel valued, it also meant that emergencies had to be handled with whatever resources were immediately available. This self-reliance had fostered a kind of competence in both partners that went beyond typical gender role expectations, with Sarah developing skills in animal husbandry and ranch management, while Daniel learned domestic arts that enabled him to share household responsibilities during busy seasons. The devastating storm that would ultimately reveal the true extent of Sarah's abilities began building in the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean during the first week of February 1893, drawing moisture and energy from ocean currents that had been unusually warm throughout the winter months. Territorial meteorologists in Seattle, working with primitive forecasting tools that relied heavily on telegraph reports from ships at sea, issued warnings that proved woefully inadequate for the unprecedented weather system that was approaching the Olympic Peninsula with the force of a natural catastrophe. Dr. Catherine Wells had arrived at Windward Ridge Ranch 3 days before the storm's predicted landfall, seeking shelter while traveling between remote settlements where her medical services were desperately needed. Her presence represented both opportunity and additional responsibility for Sarah, who had grown accustomed to managing refugee situations during severe weather but had never hosted someone whose professional skills might prove crucial during extended emergencies. The physician's initial skepticism about the ranch's supposed storm protection had gradually given way to scientific curiosity as she observed the meteorological anomalies that seemed to surround the property. The first signs of the approaching crisis became apparent when unusual wildlife behavior began manifesting throughout the peninsula, several days before the storm's arrival. Marine mammals that typically remained in deeper ocean waters appeared close to shore in unprecedented numbers, while land animals exhibited migration patterns that defied their normal territorial instincts. Sarah's cattle, normally responsive to atmospheric pressure changes that preceded severe weather, remained inexplicably calm despite clear indications that major atmospheric disturbances were approaching the region. Joseph Running Bear's visits during this period carried an urgency that Sarah had never witnessed before in the elderly Makah elder. His knowledge of traditional weather signs, accumulated over decades of observing coastal storm patterns, convinced him that the approaching system possessed characteristics that went beyond normal seasonal variations. The whale songs that ocean mammals had been producing throughout the week carried tonal qualities that tribal oral history associated with catastrophic weather events, phenomena that occurred perhaps once in a generation and required spiritual preparation that went beyond conventional storm readiness. The territorial government's response to the storm warnings revealed the inadequacy of official emergency planning for truly severe weather events. Samuel Price, the land agent who had been monitoring Sarah's ranch for potential foreclosure proceedings, arrived with instructions to document property damage for insurance purposes but possessed no authority or resources to provide actual assistance to isolated ranching families. His presence served primarily to remind Sarah that her precarious financial situation would become even more desperate if the storm caused significant damage to ranch infrastructure or livestock losses. Communications with the outside world became increasingly unreliable as the storm approached, with telegraph lines already suffering damage from preliminary wind gusts and equipment failures. The isolation that had previously been merely inconvenient transformed into a potentially life-threatening situation as Sarah realized that no external assistance would be available if emergencies arose during the storm's passage. The ranch's self-sufficiency, which had been a source of pride during normal conditions, suddenly felt inadequate for the challenges that appeared to be approaching. Frank Harrison's arrival at the ranch during this preparatory period introduced complications that went beyond simple resource-sharing concerns. His demands for access to the storm protection that Sarah's property had demonstrated during previous weather events came with implicit threats about the consequences of refusing assistance to established community members. Harrison's attitude reflected broader territorial social dynamics that positioned white male property owners as entitled to deference from widows and other vulnerable community members, regardless of the circumstances that had created their current situations. The children's reactions to the mounting tension revealed the psychological toll that their unusual circumstances had created over the winter months. Tommy had become increasingly protective of his mother and suspicious of visitors whose motives seemed questionable, while Emma had developed anxiety behaviors that manifested whenever storms were discussed. Sarah found herself managing not only the practical preparations necessary for surviving severe weather, but also the emotional needs of children who had already experienced trauma through their father's death and were now facing uncertainty about their family's continued security. Dr. Wells's professional assessment of the ranch's preparedness revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities that Sarah had not fully appreciated. The physician's inventory of medical supplies and emergency equipment highlighted the adequacy of Sarah's preparations for routine health emergencies, but also exposed gaps in resources that could become critical during extended isolation periods. Her recommendations for additional preparations were limited by the short time available before the storm's arrival and the reality that many essential supplies were simply unavailable in such remote locations. The spiritual preparations that Joseph Running Bear deemed necessary for weathering this particular storm involved whale prayer ceremonies that went far beyond the simple daily rituals that Sarah had been practicing throughout the winter. These extended spiritual observances required understanding of traditional protocols and spiritual concepts that challenged Sarah's limited experience with Makah religious practices. Joseph's patient instruction during these crucial days provided intensive education in indigenous spirituality that would have normally required months or years of gradual learning. The ranch's physical infrastructure underwent final inspections that revealed the wisdom of Daniel's construction choices while also highlighting areas where improvements would be necessary for long-term sustainability. The main buildings had been designed to withstand typical coastal storms, but the approaching weather system promised conditions that would test structural integrity beyond normal design parameters. Sarah's limited resources prevented major modifications, requiring creative solutions that demonstrated the kind of frontier ingenuity that characterized successful pioneer families. Neighboring ranchers' responses to the storm warnings varied, dramatically based on their individual circumstances and personalities. Some families evacuated to more protected locations or larger communities where mutual assistance would be available, while others chose to shelter in place and hope that their preparations would prove adequate. The Stevens family's decision to evacuate once again to Port Angeles reflected their previous winter's experience with storm damage, while Harrison's insistence on remaining at Windward Ridge Ranch represented his determination to access whatever protection Sarah's abilities might provide. The atmospheric conditions during the final preparatory period created an almost supernatural quality of anticipation that seemed to affect every living creature on the peninsula. The air pressure changes that typically preceded major storms were accompanied by electrical phenomena that went beyond normal pre-storm atmospheric disturbances. Static electricity built up to levels that made routine activities uncomfortable, while the light quality took on an unusual clarity that seemed to reveal details in the landscape that were normally invisible. Sarah's whale prayer sessions during these final preparation days achieved an intensity and focus that surprised even Joseph Running Bear with their apparent spiritual power. The songs that had initially felt awkward and foreign now flowed from her with a naturalness that suggested deep spiritual connection to the marine environment that surrounded their coastal location. The physical sensations that accompanied these prayer sessions, including enhanced awareness of oceanic rhythms and atmospheric pressures, indicated that Sarah's abilities were expanding beyond simple weather protection toward more comprehensive environmental sensitivity. The storm that struck the Olympic Peninsula on February 14, 1893, exceeded every prediction and challenged the very foundations of what territorial residents believed possible in terms of natural destruction. By the evening of the storm's first day, when wind speeds had already surpassed hurricane force and showed no signs of diminishing, Sarah Mitchell faced the most profound crisis of her life as she discovered that her mysterious abilities were not merely failing but were actively placing everyone under her protection in mortal danger. The morning had begun with the now familiar ritual of whale prayers, sung with the confidence that months of successful storm protection had built within Sarah's understanding of her unusual gifts. As she stood on Thunder Point watching the massive wave formations building offshore, the ancient Makah melodies had seemed to flow from her with even greater power than usual, creating the characteristic sense of atmospheric calm that had become synonymous with her ranch's supernatural protection. The gathered refugees, including Dr. Wells, Frank Harrison, and several other families who had sought shelter at Windward Ridge, had witnessed this demonstration with a mixture of awe and relief that had become routine during previous storms. The first indication that something was fundamentally different about this weather system came when the whale prayers that had always before created immediate atmospheric stabilization around the ranch produced no discernible effect on the approaching storm's intensity. Sarah repeated the ceremonial songs with increasing desperation as she watched the massive Pacific cyclone continue its relentless approach toward the peninsula, her voice growing hoarse as she struggled to access spiritual forces that seemed to have abandoned her when they were needed most. Joseph Running Bear, who had remained at the ranch specifically to provide guidance during what he recognized as an unprecedented spiritual challenge, observed her failed attempts with growing alarm that he attempted to conceal from the other refugees. By midday, When the storm's outer bands began affecting the peninsula with winds that immediately exceeded anything the region had experienced during Sarah's previous successes, the ranch's mysterious protection had not only failed to materialize, but seemed to have been replaced by conditions that were actively worse than those affecting neighboring properties. While other ranches reported severe but survivable wind damage, Windward Ridge Ranch experienced tornado-like conditions that threatened to destroy every structure on the property within a matter of hours. The main house, built to withstand typical coastal storms, began showing signs of structural failure as wind speeds approached levels that exceeded its design parameters. The cedar log construction that had previously provided reassuring solidity now creaked and groaned under pressures that threatened to tear the building apart around its occupants. Sarah found herself managing not only her own terror, but also the panic of refugees who had trusted in her abilities and now faced the possibility that their faith in her protection had led them into a death trap rather than providing the safety they had sought. Dr. Wells's medical expertise became crucial as the psychological stress of their situation began manifesting in physical symptoms among the shelter seekers. Frank Harrison suffered what appeared to be the early stages of a heart attack brought on by the combination of physical exertion required to secure the ranch buildings and the emotional shock of discovering that his aggressive demands for protection had resulted in greater danger than he would have faced at his own property. The physician's attempts to provide medical care were severely hampered by the building's violent motion, as winds that seemed focused specifically on their location continued to intensify beyond rational explanation. The children's terror reached levels that no amount of maternal reassurance could address as the storm's supernatural fury concentrated on their home with what seemed like malevolent intelligence. Tommy, who had developed deep pride in his mother's unusual abilities, watched her unsuccessful attempts to restore their protection with the devastating realization that the spiritual forces he had learned to trust were either powerless against this particular storm or had somehow turned against their family. Emma's hysteria required constant attention from Sarah at precisely the moment when her own spiritual and emotional resources were stretched beyond their limits. Joseph Running Bear's explanation of what was occurring provided context that made their situation even more terrifying than simple meteorological catastrophe. According to Makah's spiritual traditions, the whale prayers that Sarah had been using carried responsibilities and spiritual obligations that went far beyond simple weather control. Her growing power throughout the winter had apparently attracted the attention of oceanic spiritual forces that demanded proper ceremonial acknowledgement and cultural understanding that she had never been taught. The storm's concentrated fury on their location represented not random natural violence, but a spiritual testing that could result in death if not properly addressed. The ranch's infrastructure began failing in ways that threatened immediate survival. As wind speeds that local weather instruments could not measure tore apart buildings that had stood for nearly a decade. The barn that housed their cattle collapsed completely during the afternoon, forcing the terrified animals into the open, where they faced certain death from flying debris and exposure to conditions that no living creature could survive. Sarah's desperate attempts to rescue the livestock that represented her family's economic foundation resulted in injuries that Dr. Wells could barely treat given their limited medical supplies and the impossibility of evacuating serious cases to proper medical facilities. The failure of Sarah's abilities created a crisis of faith that went beyond practical concerns about survival to challenge the spiritual foundations that had sustained her through months of widowhood and mounting external pressures. The whale prayers that had provided not only supernatural protection, but also emotional stability and sense of purpose, now seemed to mock her desperation as she repeated them with increasing fury while watching everything she had built being destroyed around her. Joseph Running Bear's attempts to guide her through alternative spiritual approaches were hampered by the cultural knowledge gaps that previous months of instruction had not been sufficient to address. Frank Harrison's response to their deteriorating situation revealed the ugly realities of frontier social dynamics under extreme stress. His initial demands for protection had given way to accusations that Sarah had deliberately misled him about her abilities, and he began suggesting that their current predicament resulted from her inappropriate dabbling in indigenous spiritual practices that white settlers had no business attempting to access. His increasingly hostile attitude toward both Sarah and Joseph Running Bear created additional tensions that threatened to undermine any cooperative efforts to survive the crisis. The communications breakdown that had begun with telegraph line failures expanded to include the collapse of local transportation networks as roads became impassable and coastal shipping ceased entirely due to ocean conditions that maritime authorities described as beyond the limits of safe navigation. Sarah's realization that no external rescue would be possible forced her to confront the possibility that her failed abilities had not only endangered everyone who had trusted in her protection, but had created a situation where their deaths would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing cultural boundaries that should have remained inviolate. Dr. Wells's clinical assessment of their situation provided the stark medical reality that complemented the spiritual crisis Sarah was experiencing. Several of the refugees were showing signs of stress-related health problems that could become life-threatening if their circumstances did not improve within hours rather than days. The physician's professional experience with frontier emergencies convinced her that their survival prospects were diminishing rapidly as the combination of structural damage, medical emergencies, and complete isolation created cascading failures that would soon overwhelm any resources they possessed. The evening brought no relief from either the supernatural storm conditions or the spiritual crisis that had apparently caused them. Sarah's final attempts to restore their protection through increasingly desperate whale prayer sessions resulted only in what seemed like increased fury from the atmospheric forces battering their location. As darkness fell over a landscape being systematically destroyed by meteorological violence that defied explanation, Sarah faced the devastating realization that her mysterious gifts had not simply failed, but had somehow betrayed everyone who had placed their faith in her abilities, leaving them trapped in a situation where death seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The transformation that would ultimately save everyone at Windward Ridge Ranch began in the darkest hour before dawn on February 15th, when Sarah's complete spiritual and emotional collapse paradoxically opened pathways to understanding that months of successful but superficial prayer sessions had never revealed. As she knelt on the floor of the main house's central room, surrounded by injured refugees and listening to the supernatural fury that continued to tear apart everything around them, Sarah experienced what Joseph Running Bear later described as a spiritual death that preceded true rebirth into her authentic relationship with the oceanic forces that governed their coastal environment. The catalyst came not from any conscious decision on Sarah's part, but from the involuntary spiritual surrender that occurred when human will and learned techniques proved utterly inadequate for the spiritual challenge they faced. As she abandoned all attempts to control or direct the whale prayers that had previously provided their protection, the ancient Makah songs began flowing through her with a power and authenticity that transcended anything she had experienced during her months of practice. The difference was immediately apparent to Joseph Running Bear, whose lifetime of spiritual experience enabled him to recognize the shift from imitation to genuine spiritual connection. Dr. Wells, whose scientific training had initially made her skeptical of indigenous spiritual practices, found herself witnessing phenomena that challenged her understanding of natural law as the atmospheric conditions around the ranch began responding to Sarah's transformed prayer sessions. The wind patterns that had been focused on their location with destructive intensity began shifting in ways that violated meteorological principles, creating pockets of calm that spread outward from the main house like ripples on water. The change was gradual but undeniable, providing the first hope they had experienced since the supernatural storm had begun its assault on their refuge. The spiritual breakthrough that Sarah experienced involved more than simply improved technique in performing the whale prayers. It represented a fundamental transformation in her relationship with the marine environment that surrounded their coastal location. The songs that had previously been external performances, learned through careful instruction and repeated through disciplined practice, became expressions of spiritual connection that flowed from deep internal understanding of her place within the larger oceanic ecosystem. Joseph Running Bear recognized this transformation as the kind of authentic spiritual awakening that traditional Makah education was designed to facilitate over years of gradual development. The immediate practical effects of Sarah's transformed spiritual practice provided relief from their most urgent survival concerns while also revealing the true scope of abilities she had never suspected she possessed. The wind speeds that had threatened to destroy the main house began diminishing to levels that the building's structure could withstand, while the flying debris that had made outdoor movement impossible settled to the ground as atmospheric pressures stabilized around the ranch. The cattle that had been facing certain death in the collapsed barn found shelter in wind shadows that formed around natural landscape features as the supernatural storm's fury was gradually redirected away from their location. Frank Harrison's response to the changing conditions revealed the depth of his cultural prejudices and his inability to acknowledge the indigenous spiritual traditions that were saving his life. Rather than expressing gratitude for the protection that Sarah's transformed abilities were providing, he attributed the improvement to coincidental changes in the storm's natural patterns and continued to insist that their previous crisis had resulted from irresponsible dabbling in practices that white settlers should avoid. His persistent hostility toward Joseph Running Bear, even as the Makah elders' guidance proved essential for their survival, demonstrated the kind of cultural blindness that characterized many frontier relationships between settler and indigenous communities. Dr. Wells's scientific curiosity about the phenomena she was witnessing led to careful observations that would later provide some of the most detailed documentation of indigenous spiritual practices ever recorded by mainstream medical professionals. Her clinical notes, maintained throughout the crisis despite the obviously challenging circumstances, captured details about the relationship between Sarah's prayer sessions and measurable changes in atmospheric conditions that suggested mechanisms of influence that conventional meteorology could not explain. The physician's eventual publication of these observations would contribute to growing scientific interest in traditional indigenous knowledge systems. The children's recovery from the terror they had experienced during the storm's worst phases demonstrated the resilience that frontier life had developed within their young personalities, while also revealing the deep psychological impact that witnessing their mother's spiritual transformation had created. Tommy's understanding of the cultural knowledge that Joseph Running Bear represented evolved from childish curiosity to genuine respect for traditional wisdom that would influence his entire approach to the natural environment throughout his life. Emma's ability to incorporate elements of Makah spiritual practices into her own developing sense of identity reflected the kind of cultural synthesis that would characterize the next generation of Pacific Northwest residents. The refugee families who had sought shelter at Windward Ridge Ranch experienced the storm's resolution as a profound spiritual event that challenged their own understanding of the relationship between human communities and natural forces. The protection that Sarah's transformed abilities provided extended beyond simple meteorological benefits to include a sense of spiritual sanctuary that many of them had never experienced in their frontier lives. Their subsequent accounts of the events at the ranch would contribute to Sarah's growing reputation throughout the territory, while also spreading awareness of indigenous spiritual traditions among settler communities. Joseph Running Bear's recognition of Sarah's authentic spiritual development opened possibilities for deeper cultural education that went far beyond the emergency whale prayer instruction he had initially provided. Her demonstrated ability to access genuine spiritual connection with oceanic forces qualified her for traditional Makah spiritual training that was normally reserved for tribal members who had undergone years of preparatory development. The elder's decision to offer such training to a white settler woman represented a significant departure from normal cultural protocols, but he recognized that Sarah's gifts transcended conventional ethnic boundaries. The storm's gradual resolution. Throughout the morning hours of February, 15th provided dramatic evidence of the transformation in Sarah's spiritual relationship with the marine environment. As her whale prayers achieved increasing authenticity and power, the supernatural weather conditions that had defied all meteorological explanation began dissipating in patterns that seemed to respond directly to her ceremonial activities. The process was not instantaneous, but rather demonstrated the kind of gradual spiritual influence that traditional indigenous practices were designed to exercise over natural phenomena through patient, respectful engagement rather than attempts at domination or control. The ranch infrastructure that had survived the storm's assault showed damage patterns that seemed to reflect the spiritual journey Sarah had undergone during the crisis. Buildings and equipment that had been present during her earlier superficial successes with storm protection bore evidence of the supernatural violence that had tested their location, while newer structures and areas where she had focused her transformed spiritual practices remained mysteriously undamaged. Dr. Wells's documentation of these damage patterns provided physical evidence that the protection Sarah's abilities offered was not simply psychological comfort, but represented measurable influence over environmental conditions. The communication with neighboring ranches that became possible as the storm subsided revealed the extent to which Windward Ridge Ranch had been specifically targeted by meteorological conditions that defied normal storm behavior. Other properties throughout the peninsula had experienced severe but predictable storm damage, while Sarah's location had endured supernatural violence followed by equally inexplicable protection that correlated directly with her spiritual development. The contrast was so pronounced that territorial authorities would eventually launch investigations into the phenomena, though their conventional scientific approaches would prove inadequate for understanding the spiritual dimensions of what had occurred. The spiritual knowledge that Sarah gained through her crisis-driven transformation established foundations for abilities that would continue developing throughout the remainder of her life. Her authentic connection with oceanic spiritual forces provided not only enhanced weather prediction and protection capabilities, but also access to traditional indigenous knowledge systems that encompassed everything from marine ecology to herbal medicine. Joseph Running Bear's commitment to providing comprehensive spiritual education would transform Sarah from an isolated widow struggling for survival into a cultural bridge between settler and indigenous communities that would benefit the entire region for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's spiritual breakthrough brought a period of careful consolidation as she worked to understand and stabilize the profound abilities that had manifested during the supernatural storm crisis. The whale prayers that now flowed through her with authentic power required delicate management to maintain the protection they provided, while avoiding the spiritual imbalances that had nearly proven catastrophic during her learning process. Joseph Running Bear's guidance during these crucial weeks proved essential as Sarah navigated the complex relationship between her transformed abilities and the practical demands of managing both her ranch operations and the growing community of people who sought refuge at Windward Ridge. Dr. Catherine Wells's decision to extend her stay at the ranch beyond the original emergency period reflected both her professional fascination with the phenomena she had witnessed and her growing recognition that Sarah's abilities represented a unique opportunity for advancing medical understanding of traditional healing practices. The physician's systematic documentation of the relationship between Sarah's spiritual sessions and measurable environmental changes provided scientific credibility that would prove crucial when territorial authorities began investigating reports of supernatural weather control. Her clinical observations also revealed that Sarah's transformation had activated healing abilities that complemented her weather influence, opening possibilities for integrating indigenous medicine with conventional medical practice. The structural damage assessment that followed the storm revealed patterns that defied conventional engineering analysis while providing insights into the spiritual dimensions of the protection Sarah's abilities offered. Buildings and equipment that had been present during her earlier, less authentic prayer sessions showed evidence of the supernatural violence that had tested their location, while areas where her transformed spiritual connection had been strongest remained mysteriously undamaged. The main house's central room, where Sarah's spiritual breakthrough had occurred, showed no storm damage whatsoever, despite having been at the epicenter of meteorological conditions that had destroyed structures throughout the peninsula. Frank Harrison's eventual departure from the ranch occurred under circumstances that highlighted the cultural divisions that Sarah's abilities both bridged and exacerbated within territorial society. His inability to acknowledge the indigenous spiritual traditions that had saved his life, combined with his persistent hostility toward Joseph Running Bear's presence at the ranch, created tensions that ultimately made his continued residence untenable. Harrison's subsequent accounts of events at Windward Ridge Ranch spread throughout the settler community with deliberate distortions that emphasize supposed dangers of indigenous spiritual practices would contribute to the controversy that surrounded Sarah's growing reputation. The children's adaptation to their transformed circumstances demonstrated remarkable resilience, while also revealing the profound impact that witnessing authentic spiritual power had created within their developing worldviews. Tommy's fascination with the traditional knowledge that Joseph Running Bear represented evolved into a genuine apprenticeship relationship that would influence his entire approach to environmental stewardship throughout his life. Emma's natural incorporation of Makah spiritual concepts into her daily activities reflected the kind of cultural synthesis that characterized children who grew up at the intersection of different knowledge systems. The ranch's economic situation underwent gradual improvement as Sarah's enhanced environmental awareness enabled innovations in cattle management and agricultural practices that went far beyond simple weather protection. Her ability to sense atmospheric pressure changes and oceanic current patterns days in advance allowed for livestock management decisions that minimize storm damage while maximizing grazing efficiency during favorable conditions. The traditional ecological knowledge that Joseph Running Bear shared, combined with Sarah's intuitive understanding of environmental patterns, created a ranch operation that achieved unprecedented sustainability and productivity. The refugee management system that developed at Windward Ridge Ranch during the weeks following the supernatural storm established protocols that balanced Sarah's desire to provide assistance with the practical limitations of her resources and the cultural sensitivities surrounding her abilities. Dr. Wells's medical expertise proved invaluable in screening potential residents for health issues that could become problematic during extended isolation periods, while Joseph Running Bear's cultural guidance helped establish spiritual protocols that maintained the respectful relationship with oceanic forces that Sarah's protection required. The communications network that gradually re-established connections between the ranch and the broader territorial community brought news of the storm's unprecedented impact throughout the Pacific Northwest region. The meteorological violence that had devastated the Olympic Peninsula had extended far beyond normal storm boundaries, affecting areas as distant as the Columbia River Valley and the Puget Sound Basin. Sarah's ranch had not simply been protected from a local weather event, but had served as a sanctuary during what territorial authorities were beginning to recognize as the most destructive natural disaster in the region's recorded history. Samuel Price's renewed interest in the ranch's legal and financial status reflected the territorial government's growing awareness that Sarah's property represented something far more significant than a simple homestead facing potential foreclosure. His investigative reports to territorial authorities documented not only the supernatural protection that the ranch had demonstrated, but also its potential strategic value as a safe haven during future natural disasters. The land agent's evolving attitude towards Sarah's situation, from predatory opportunism to respectful recognition of her unique circumstances, mirrored broader changes in territorial approaches to indigenous knowledge and frontier community development. The spiritual education that Joseph Running Bear provided during this stabilization period went far beyond the emergency whale prayer instruction that had initiated Sarah's transformation. His comprehensive introduction to Makah spiritual traditions included not only ceremonial practices but also the ethical frameworks and cultural responsibilities that governed authentic spiritual power. Sarah's education in traditional ecological knowledge encompassed everything from marine biology concepts that had been developed over centuries of coastal living to astronomical observations that guided seasonal planning and ceremonial timing. The neighboring ranchers' responses to reports of supernatural weather control at Windward Ridge Ranch varied dramatically, based on their individual cultural backgrounds and practical experiences with frontier challenges. Martha Stevens's supportive attitude reflected her personal experience with the ranch's protection during previous storms, while other settlers' skepticism often masked deeper anxieties about the implications of indigenous spiritual practices for territorial social hierarchies. The cultural tensions that Sarah's abilities created within the broader community would continue to influence regional development patterns for decades to come. The medical discoveries that Dr. Wells documented during her extended residence at the ranch provided some of the first scientific evidence for the effectiveness of traditional indigenous healing practices when applied by individuals with authentic spiritual training. Sarah's developing abilities in herbal medicine and energy healing complemented her weather influence while also offering practical benefits for the health and welfare of ranch residents. The physician's careful documentation of treatment outcomes would later contribute to growing medical interest in integrative approaches that combined conventional and traditional healing methods. The seasonal planning that became possible through Sarah's enhanced environmental awareness revolutionized ranch operations while also demonstrating the practical applications of indigenous ecological knowledge for frontier agriculture. Her ability to predict weather patterns months in advance allowed for strategic decisions about crop planting, livestock breeding, and infrastructure development that maximized efficiency while minimizing environmental impact. The agricultural innovations that resulted from combining traditional knowledge with frontier farming techniques would eventually spread throughout the Pacific Northwest region. The spiritual protocols that governed Sarah's use of her abilities required careful attention to cultural traditions and environmental ethics that distinguished authentic spiritual practice from superficial imitation. Joseph Running Bear's instruction emphasized the reciprocal responsibilities that accompanied spiritual power, including obligations to protect and nurture the marine environment that was the source of her abilities. These ethical dimensions of spiritual practice would prove crucial for maintaining the long-term sustainability of the protection that Sarah's ranch provided. The refugee testimonials that began circulating throughout territorial communities provided first-hand accounts of the supernatural protection that Windward Ridge Ranch offered while also spreading awareness of indigenous spiritual traditions among settler populations. These personal narratives, often shared in church meetings and community gatherings, created cultural bridges that went beyond simple curiosity about unusual phenomena to include genuine respect for traditional knowledge systems. The impact of these stories on territorial attitudes toward indigenous peoples would contribute to gradually improving relationships between settler and native communities. The stability that Sarah had achieved through her spiritual transformation faced its most serious test when territorial authorities launched a formal investigation into reports of supernatural weather control, bringing external pressures that threatened not only her family's security, but also the delicate cultural relationships that sustained her abilities. Commissioner James Hartwell's arrival at Windward Ridge Ranch in early March represented the territorial government's attempt to understand phenomena that challenged conventional scientific knowledge, while also addressing political concerns about the implications of indigenous spiritual practices for frontier social order. The investigation team that accompanied Commissioner Hartwell included territorial scientists, military officials, and religious representatives, whose diverse perspectives reflected the complex nature of the challenges that Sarah's abilities posed for conventional understanding. Dr. Edmund Blackstone, the territorial meteorologist whose weather predictions had proven woefully inadequate during the February storm, approached the ranch with professional skepticism tinged by personal embarrassment about his failure to anticipate the supernatural weather patterns. Reverend Michael Thompson's presence represented evangelical concerns about the spiritual implications of indigenous practices among Christian settlers, while Captain Robert Hayes's military perspective focused on potential strategic applications of weather control capabilities. The cultural tensions that emerged during the official investigation revealed the depth of prejudice and misunderstanding that characterized territorial attitudes toward indigenous peoples despite decades of coexistence on the frontier. Commissioner Hartwell's questions about Joseph Running Bear's role in Sarah's spiritual development reflected assumptions about indigenous manipulation of vulnerable white settlers, rather than recognition of authentic cultural exchange and spiritual mentorship. The investigative team's inability to comprehend the ethical frameworks that governed traditional spiritual practices led to increasingly inappropriate requests for demonstrations that violated both cultural protocols and spiritual safety requirements. Sarah's attempts to explain her abilities in terms that territorial authorities could understand proved frustratingly inadequate, as conventional scientific vocabulary lacked concepts necessary for describing spiritual relationships with environmental forces. The whale prayers that formed the foundation of her weather influence could not be reduced to simple cause and effect mechanisms without losing the essential spiritual dimensions that made them effective. Dr. Wells's scientific documentation provided valuable evidence for the reality of the phenomena, but even her careful observations could not bridge the conceptual gap between materialist science and indigenous spiritual knowledge. The children's exposure to the official investigation created educational opportunities that also highlighted the cultural prejudices that Tommy and Emma would need to navigate throughout their lives as products of cross-cultural spiritual training. Commissioner Hartwell's patronizing attitude toward their participation in Makah ceremonial activities reflected broader territorial assumptions about appropriate childhood development that ignored the sophisticated knowledge systems they were accessing through Joseph Running Bear's instruction. The investigation team's failure to recognize the children's genuine understanding of traditional ecological concepts demonstrated the limitations of conventional educational approaches for frontier environmental challenges. The legal implications of the territorial investigation extended far beyond simple scientific curiosity to include questions about property rights, indigenous sovereignty, and the appropriate role of traditional knowledge in territorial governance. Sarah's abilities had developed through spiritual practices that originated on traditional Makah lands, raising complex questions about cultural ownership and the appropriate compensation for indigenous intellectual property. The territorial government's desire to exploit weather control capabilities for economic and military purposes conflicted with both ethical obligations to indigenous communities and the spiritual requirements that sustained Sarah's powers. The economic pressures that intensified during the investigation period reflected the territorial government's recognition that weather control capabilities could provide significant commercial advantages for agricultural and shipping operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Samuel Price's reassessment of the ranch's financial value revealed that Sarah's property had become one of the most strategically important locations in the territory, creating new pressures for development that threatened both the environmental conditions and cultural relationships necessary for maintaining her spiritual abilities. Dr. Wells's professional reputation faced challenges from medical colleagues who questioned her scientific objectivity after her extended residence at the Pai Ranch and her documented observations of indigenous healing practices. The physician's advocacy for integrating traditional medicine with conventional medical care encountered resistance from territorial medical authorities, who viewed such approaches as threats to professional standards and scientific progress. Her detailed documentation of Sarah's healing abilities would eventually contribute to broader medical recognition of traditional knowledge systems, but the immediate professional costs were significant. The spiritual challenges that emerged during this period went beyond external pressures to include internal conflicts about the appropriate use of abilities that carried profound cultural responsibilities. Joseph Running Bear's instruction had emphasized that spiritual power was not personal property, but rather a trust that carried obligations to serve both human and environmental communities. Sarah's growing recognition of these responsibilities created tensions between her desire to protect her family's security and her spiritual obligations to use her abilities for broader community benefit. The regional weather patterns that developed during the investigation period demonstrated the complex relationship between Sarah's spiritual practices and larger environmental systems that extended far beyond her immediate ranch location. Her whale prayers appeared to influence atmospheric conditions throughout the Olympic Peninsula, creating responsibilities for environmental stewardship that went far beyond personal or family interests. The territorial government's attempts to direct her abilities for specific economic purposes conflicted with the spiritual protocols that required respectful engagement with natural forces rather than attempts at domination or exploitation. The cultural education that Joseph Running Bear provided during this challenging period included instruction in traditional approaches to dealing with external pressures and maintaining spiritual integrity under adverse circumstances. Makah history included numerous examples of cultural survival strategies that had enabled indigenous communities to preserve essential knowledge and practices, despite systematic attempts at cultural suppression. These historical lessons would prove crucial as Sarah navigated the political pressures that accompanied her growing reputation and abilities. The community support networks that had developed around the ranch faced severe testing as territorial authorities attempted to identify and interview everyone who had witnessed supernatural weather protection. The refugee families who had found shelter at Windward Ridge during various storms found themselves subject to official questioning that often carried implicit threats about the consequences of supporting practices that challenged conventional understanding. The loyalty that many of these families demonstrated despite official pressure reflected the genuine benefits they had received from Sarah's abilities and their respect for the cultural traditions that sustained them. The agricultural innovations that Sarah had implemented based on traditional ecological knowledge attracted attention from territorial development officials who recognized their potential for improving frontier farming productivity. However, attempts to separate these techniques from their spiritual and cultural contexts proved unsuccessful, as the environmental awareness that made them effective was inseparably connected to the same spiritual practices that provided weather protection. The territorial government's frustration with the holistic nature of indigenous knowledge systems would continue to influence official policies toward traditional practices for decades to come. The military implications of weather control capabilities created the most serious external pressures that Sarah faced during this period. as territorial defense officials recognized the strategic advantages that reliable weather influence could provide during conflicts with indigenous peoples or foreign powers. Captain Hayes's requests for demonstrations of offensive weather capabilities violated fundamental spiritual principles while also threatening the reciprocal relationships with environmental forces that sustained Sarah's abilities. Her refusal to weaponize her spiritual practices created tensions with territorial authorities that would persist long after the formal investigation concluded. The profound changes in Sarah's understanding of herself and her place in the world accelerated during the spring months of 1893 as she worked to integrate the spiritual transformation she had experienced with the practical demands of managing her expanding role as a cultural bridge between settler and indigenous communities. The woman who had begun the winter as an isolated widow struggling for survival had evolved into a spiritual practitioner whose abilities carried responsibilities that extended far beyond her immediate family's welfare to encompass environmental stewardship and cultural preservation that would influence the entire Pacific Northwest region. Joseph Running Bear's comprehensive spiritual education during this period revealed the depth of traditional knowledge systems that had been developed over centuries of indigenous life on the Olympic Peninsula. His instruction went far beyond the whale prayers that had initiated Sarah's transformation to include sophisticated understanding of marine ecology, astronomical observations, and spiritual practices that integrated human communities with natural environments in sustainable ways. Sarah's capacity to absorb and apply this knowledge demonstrated intellectual abilities that had been suppressed during her conventional frontier existence but now flourished under the guidance of authentic cultural mentorship. Dr. Catherine Wells's extended collaboration with Sarah provided unique opportunities for documenting the integration of traditional and conventional knowledge systems while also revealing the physician's own evolution from scientific skepticism to genuine appreciation for indigenous healing practices. Her clinical observations of Sarah's developing abilities in herbal medicine and energy healing challenged conventional medical understanding while providing evidence for therapeutic approaches that achieved results beyond what contemporary medicine could offer. The partnership that developed between the two women would eventually contribute to significant advances in integrative medical practice throughout the territorial healthcare system. The children's education under Joseph Running Bear's guidance created learning opportunities that went far beyond conventional frontier schooling to include sophisticated environmental knowledge and cultural understanding that would serve them throughout their lives. Tommy's natural aptitude for traditional ecological practices, combined with his frontier upbringing to create a unique synthesis of knowledge systems that enabled him to serve as a translator between cultural perspectives that often seemed incompatible. Emma's intuitive grasp of spiritual concepts reflected her exposure to authentic cultural practices during crucial developmental periods when children are most receptive to diverse worldviews. Sarah's evolving relationship with the marine environment that surrounded her coastal ranch revealed abilities that extended far beyond simple weather influence to include communication with ocean mammals and intuitive understanding of ecosystem dynamics that maritime scientists would not achieve for decades. Her whale prayer sessions had become genuine conversations with spiritual forces that governed oceanic systems, providing insights into environmental changes and marine behavior, patterns that proved invaluable for both ranch management and broader ecological understanding. The depth of connection she achieved with these natural forces reflected spiritual development that typically required lifelong dedication to traditional practices. The financial independence that Sarah achieved through her enhanced environmental awareness and innovative ranch management techniques freed her from the economic pressures that had previously constrained her choices while also providing resources for supporting the expanding community that sought refuge at Windward Ridge. Her ability to predict weather patterns and ocean conditions enabled strategic decisions about livestock management, crop production, and shipping arrangements that maximized profitability while maintaining environmental sustainability. The economic success that resulted from applying traditional ecological knowledge to frontier agriculture would eventually influence development patterns throughout the territory. The spiritual responsibilities that accompanied Sarah's growing abilities required careful attention to cultural protocols and ethical obligations that distinguished authentic spiritual practice from superficial imitation or exploitation. Joseph Running Bear's instruction emphasized that spiritual power was not personal achievement, but rather a trust that carried obligations to serve both human and environmental communities with wisdom and restraint. Sarah's gradual understanding of these responsibilities reflected spiritual maturity that enabled her to navigate the complex political and cultural pressures that surrounded her unusual circumstances. The regional reputation that Sarah developed during this period extended far beyond simple curiosity about supernatural weather protection to include recognition of her role as a cultural bridge between settler and indigenous communities that offered models for more respectful and sustainable frontier development. Her ranch became a destination for individuals seeking authentic cultural education, medical treatment that integrated traditional and conventional approaches, and spiritual guidance that addressed the environmental challenges facing territorial communities. The influence she exercised through these various roles would continue expanding throughout her lifetime. The technological innovations that Sarah developed by combining traditional knowledge with frontier engineering created agricultural and construction techniques that proved superior to conventional approaches for the unique environmental conditions of the Pacific Northwest. Her understanding of local weather patterns and soil conditions, enhanced by spiritual connection to environmental forces, enabled infrastructure development that withstood natural disasters while maintaining harmony with ecological systems. These innovations would eventually influence territorial development policies while demonstrating the practical value of indigenous knowledge for frontier challenges. The healing abilities that emerged as Sarah's spiritual development progressed provided medical services that complemented Dr. Wells's conventional practice while also offering therapeutic approaches that addressed health problems beyond the scope of contemporary medicine. Her intuitive diagnosis capabilities, enhanced by traditional training in herbal medicine and energy healing, enabled treatment of conditions that conventional physicians often found puzzling or intractable. The medical partnership that developed between the two women created a model for integrative healthcare that would influence regional medical practice for generations. The cultural preservation work that became central to Sarah's mission reflected her growing understanding of the threats that territorial development posed to indigenous knowledge systems and her recognition of her unique position to document and protect traditional practices for future generations. Her collaboration with Joseph Running Bear in recording Makah spiritual traditions, ecological knowledge, and cultural practices created archives that would prove invaluable for cultural survival during periods of systematic suppression. Preservation work also enabled Sarah to develop deeper understanding of the cultural contexts that sustained her spiritual abilities. The environmental advocacy that emerged from Sarah's spiritual connection to oceanic forces reflected her growing awareness of the threats that industrial development posed to the marine ecosystems that sustained both indigenous communities and her own abilities. Her observations of environmental changes, enhanced by traditional ecological knowledge and spiritual sensitivity, enabled early detection of pollution and resource depletion that conventional science would not recognize for decades. The advocacy work that resulted from these insights would eventually influence territorial environmental policies while establishing Sarah as a pioneer in ecological protection. The mentorship relationships that Sarah developed with other women facing similar challenges of cultural transition and spiritual development created support networks that extended her influence throughout territorial communities. Her ability to teach simplified versions of traditional practices while maintaining respect for their cultural origins enabled other settlers to develop more harmonious relationships with the natural environment while avoiding the cultural appropriation that could undermine indigenous communities. The educational work that resulted from these relationships would contribute to gradually improving cross-cultural understanding throughout the region. The international recognition that Sarah's abilities eventually attracted reflected the broader significance of her synthesis of traditional and frontier knowledge for understanding human relationships with natural environments. Scientific expeditions from universities and research institutions throughout North America would eventually visit Windward Ridge Ranch to study the phenomena she demonstrated while documenting the traditional knowledge systems that sustained them. The scholarly attention that resulted from these studies would contribute to growing academic interest in indigenous knowledge while establishing Sarah as a significant figure in the emerging field of environmental science. The synthesis of spiritual traditions and practical innovation that characterized Sarah's approach to ranch management reached its fullest expression during the late spring of 1893 when her collaboration with both Joseph Running Bear and Dr. Catherine Wells produced discoveries that would revolutionize understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and environmental systems throughout the Pacific Northwest region. The breakthrough came through careful documentation of the precise mechanisms by which traditional whale prayers influenced atmospheric conditions, revealing scientific principles that bridged indigenous spiritual knowledge and emerging theories about electromagnetic phenomena in ways that neither cultural tradition alone could have achieved. Dr. Wells's systematic observations of the physiological changes that occurred during Sarah's spiritual practices provided the first scientific evidence for measurable alterations in human bioelectric fields that correlated directly with environmental responses to the whale prayer ceremonies. Her medical instruments detected changes in Sarah's nervous system activity, heart rhythm patterns, and electromagnetic emissions that coincided with atmospheric pressure variations and wind pattern modifications around the Fuca ranch. The precision of these correlations suggested causal mechanisms that operated through natural laws that conventional science was only beginning to understand. Joseph Running Bear's detailed explanation of traditional Makah understanding of the spiritual forces that governed oceanic systems provided cultural context that enabled interpretation of Dr. Wells's scientific data in ways that revealed the sophisticated knowledge of natural phenomena that indigenous peoples had developed through centuries of careful observation. His descriptions of the ceremonial protocols that maintained harmony between human consciousness and environmental forces offered frameworks for understanding how Sarah's spiritual practices achieved their effects through respectful engagement with natural systems rather than attempts at domination or control. The technological innovations that emerged from combining traditional knowledge with scientific methodology created new approaches to weather prediction and environmental management that proved superior to either cultural system alone. Sarah's enhanced sensitivity to atmospheric conditions, amplified by Dr. Wells's instrumentation and interpreted through Joseph Running Bear's traditional knowledge, enabled weather forecasting with accuracy levels that territorial meteorologists could not match. The collaborative approach that produced these results demonstrated the potential for cultural synthesis to generate knowledge that transcended the limitations of individual traditions. The agricultural applications of their collaborative discoveries revolutionized ranch productivity while also providing models for sustainable farming practices that maintained ecological balance. Sarah's ability to sense soil conditions and predict optimal planting times combined with traditional Makah knowledge of coastal agriculture and Dr. Wells's understanding of plant physiology, created farming techniques that maximized crop yields while enhancing rather than depleting soil fertility. The success of these methods attracted attention from territorial, agricultural authorities who recognized their potential for improving frontier farming throughout the region. The medical breakthroughs that resulted from integrating Sarah's healing abilities with Dr. Wells's conventional practice created therapeutic approaches that addressed health problems from perspectives that neither traditional nor contemporary medicine could provide independently. Sarah's intuitive diagnosis capabilities, enhanced by traditional herbal knowledge and guided by Dr. Wells's clinical expertise, enabled treatment of conditions that had previously been considered incurable or poorly understood. The medical partnership that developed between the two women established models for integrative healthcare that would influence regional medical practice for decades. The environmental monitoring system that they developed through collaborative observation revealed ecological changes and pollution sources that conventional territorial authorities had failed to detect despite their potential impact on regional development and public health. Sarah's spiritual connection to oceanic forces, interpreted through traditional ecological knowledge and documented by Dr. Wells's scientific methods, provided early warning of environmental threats that could affect both marine ecosystems and human communities. The environmental advocacy that resulted from these discoveries would eventually influence territorial policies toward industrial development and resource management. The educational programs that emerged from their collaborative work created unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural learning that benefited both settler and indigenous communities, while preserving traditional knowledge for future generations. Sarah's role as a cultural bridge, supported by Joseph Running Bear's traditional expertise and Dr. Wells's scientific credibility, enabled educational exchanges that overcame the cultural prejudices and mutual suspicions that typically hindered communication between different knowledge traditions. The educational initiatives that resulted from their partnership would continue expanding throughout the territory. The spiritual guidance that their collaboration provided for other individuals seeking to develop similar abilities created support networks that extended the benefits of traditional knowledge to broader community populations. Sarah's teaching methods, refined through Joseph Running Bear's cultural guidance and validated by Dr. Wells's scientific observations, enabled other settlers to develop enhanced environmental sensitivity while maintaining respect for the indigenous origins of the practices they were learning. The spiritual education that resulted from these efforts would contribute to gradually improving relationships between settler and native communities throughout the region. The international scholarly attention that their collaborative discoveries attracted brought recognition and resources that enabled expansion of their work while also providing protection from territorial authorities who might otherwise have attempted to suppress or exploit their abilities. Scientific delegations from universities throughout North America visited Windward Ridge Ranch to study their methods and document their results, creating academic support networks that validated their approaches, while ensuring preservation of their knowledge for future researchers. The scholarly recognition that resulted from these studies would establish their work as significant contributions to emerging fields of environmental and consciousness studies. The technological innovations that grew out of their collaborative research created practical applications that improved life for frontier communities, while demonstrating the potential for traditional knowledge to contribute to technological development. Their weather prediction methods, agricultural techniques, and medical treatments provided tools that enhanced both survival and prosperity for territorial residents, while maintaining harmony with natural systems. The practical success of these innovations would eventually lead to their adoption throughout the Pacific Northwest region and beyond. The cultural preservation initiatives that became central to their collaborative mission reflected their shared recognition of the threats that Territorial development posed to indigenous knowledge systems and their commitment to Kea, protecting traditional practices for future generations. Their systematic documentation of Makah spiritual traditions, ecological knowledge, and cultural practices created archives that would prove invaluable for cultural survival during subsequent periods of systematic suppression. The preservation work also provided foundations for the cultural revival movements that would emerge in later generations. The regional transformation that resulted from their collaborative efforts extended far beyond their immediate ranch location to influence development patterns, environmental policies, and cultural relationships throughout the Pacific Northwest Territory. Their demonstration that traditional and conventional knowledge systems could be integrated beneficially challenged assumptions about cultural hierarchy and technological progress that had previously guided territorial development. The influence of their work would continue shaping regional approaches to environmental management and cross-cultural cooperation for generations to come. The legacy of collaborative innovation that Sarah, Joseph Running Bear, and Dr. Wells established at Windward Ridge Ranch would eventually serve as a model for similar partnerships throughout North America and beyond, demonstrating the potential for authentic cultural exchange to generate knowledge and capabilities that neither tradition could achieve independently. Their success in bridging different ways of understanding natural phenomena would inspire subsequent generations of researchers, spiritual practitioners, and community leaders to seek similar collaborative approaches to environmental and social challenges. The foundation they created for respectful integration of diverse knowledge systems would continue influencing human relationships with natural environments long after their individual contributions had become part of regional history. The success of Sarah's collaborative innovations with Joseph Running Bear and Dr. Catherine Wells attracted opposition from powerful territorial interests who perceived their cultural bridge building and environmental advocacy as threats to established economic and political structures throughout the Pacific Northwest region. Commissioner James Hartwell's investigation had concluded with grudging acknowledgement of the phenomena at Windward Ridge Ranch, but his report to territorial authorities also included recommendations for controlling and exploiting Sarah's abilities. That conflicted fundamentally with the spiritual protocols and cultural responsibilities that sustained her powers. The territorial legislature's attempt to claim legal jurisdiction over weather control capabilities represented the most serious external challenge that Sarah faced during the summer of 1893. Senator William Blackwood's proposed legislation have classified her abilities as territorial resources subject to government regulation, essentially transforming her spiritual practices into state property that could be deployed for economic and military purposes without regard for indigenous cultural rights or environmental ethics. The legal framework that Blackwood envisioned treated traditional knowledge as primitive technology that could be appropriated and improved through conventional scientific methods rather than recognizing it as sophisticated spiritual practice that required cultural understanding and ethical restraint. The religious opposition that emerged from evangelical Christian communities throughout the territory reflected deeper theological concerns about the spiritual implications of indigenous practices among Christian settlers. Reverend Michael Thompson's campaign against what he characterized as pagan influences on frontier communities gained support from congregations who viewed Sarah's abilities as evidence of satanic deception rather than authentic spiritual development. His sermon series titled The Dangers of Heathen Practices specifically targeted the whale prayers and traditional healing methods that had proven so effective at Windward Ridge Ranch, arguing that Christian settlers who participated in such activities were endangering their eternal souls. The economic pressures that intensified during this period came from territorial development interests who recognized that Sarah's environmental advocacy threatened profitable exploitation of natural resources throughout the Olympic Peninsula. Her ability to predict and document environmental changes that conventional science had not yet detected enabled early warnings about pollution and resource depletion that could interfere with mining, logging, and industrial development projects. The business coalition that formed to oppose her influence included some of the territory's most powerful economic interests, who viewed environmental protection as an obstacle to progress and prosperity. The academic resistance that Dr. Wells encountered from territorial medical and scientific authorities reflected institutional prejudices against both women practitioners and indigenous knowledge systems that characterized higher education throughout the late 19th century. Her publications documenting the effectiveness of traditional healing methods and the scientific validity of spiritual practices face systematic rejection from academic journals, whose editorial boards dismissed such research as unscientific, despite the rigorous methodology and compelling evidence that her studies provided. The professional isolation that resulted from this academic opposition threatened her career while also limiting the dissemination of their collaborative discoveries. The military pressure that Captain Robert Hayes continued to exert reflected territorial defense concerns about potential conflicts with indigenous peoples and foreign powers that could benefit from weather control capabilities. His repeated requests for demonstrations of offensive weather applications violated fundamental spiritual principles while also threatening the reciprocal relationships with environmental forces that sustained Sarah's abilities. The military's inability to understand that spiritual power could not be weaponized without destroying its essential nature created ongoing tensions that required careful diplomatic management to avoid direct confrontation with territorial authorities. The cultural backlash that emerged from some settler communities reflected anxieties about changing social hierarchies and the implications of indigenous knowledge for frontier identity and status. Frank Harrison's continued campaign against what he characterized as dangerous cultural mixing found support among settlers, who viewed their rejection of indigenous practices as essential to their civilized identity. His public speeches warning about the corrupting influence of native spirituality on white women and children appealed to racial prejudices while also expressing genuine fears about cultural change that threatened established social structures. The legal challenges that territorial authorities attempted to impose on the ranch's operations included licensing requirements for medical practice, restrictions on religious activities, and zoning regulations that would have prevented the refuge functions that had become central to Sarah's mission. Samuel Price's enforcement efforts, now directed by territorial officials rather than his previous personal interests, created bureaucratic obstacles designed to limit the ranch's influence while maintaining the appearance of legal compliance. The administrative harassment that resulted from these measures required significant time and resources to address while also creating uncertainty about the ranch's long-term viability. The family pressures that mounted during this period included threats to remove Tommy and Emma from Sarah's custody based on allegations that their exposure to indigenous spiritual practices constituted educational neglect and cultural corruption. The territorial child welfare authorities who investigated these claims operated from assumptions about appropriate childhood development that dismissed traditional knowledge as primitive superstition unsuitable for civilized children. Sarah's determination to protect her children's access to comprehensive cultural education while also satisfying legal requirements for conventional schooling created complex challenges that required innovative solutions. The international complications that arose from scholarly attention to their work included territorial concerns about foreign interference in domestic affairs and the potential for sensitive information about weather control capabilities to reach hostile powers. The European scientific expeditions that sought to study Sarah's abilities triggered territorial security concerns while also creating diplomatic pressures that required careful navigation to maintain international scholarly relationships without compromising territorial interests. The global implications of their discoveries had attracted attention from governments and institutions whose motives were not always aligned with Sarah's spiritual and cultural commitments. The environmental opposition that emerged from industrial interests reflected their recognition that Sarah's advocacy for ecological protection could interfere with profitable resource extraction throughout the region. The logging companies whose operations were being documented and criticized through her environmental monitoring faced pressure from territorial authorities to respond to her challenges, while also seeking ways to discredit her observations and limit her influence. The pollution sources that her spiritual sensitivity had enabled early detection of included territorial government facilities whose environmental violations carried political implications beyond simple regulatory compliance. The media attention that territorial newspapers began focusing on the ranch created public relations challenges that required careful management to maintain privacy and security while also advancing their educational and advocacy missions. The sensationalized accounts that characterized much of the newspaper coverage emphasized supernatural spectacle rather than the serious cultural and scientific work that formed the foundation of their activities. The public curiosity that resulted from this media attention brought both supporters and opponents to the ranch, while also creating security concerns about individuals whose motives might not be benign. The political maneuvering that surrounded territorial elections during this period included attempts by various candidates to exploit public interest in weather control for electoral advantage, while also appealing to cultural prejudices against indigenous practices. Sarah's careful neutrality in partisan politics did not prevent her abilities from becoming campaign issues as candidates sought to position themselves as either supporters or opponents of what they characterized as supernatural influences on territorial affairs. The political attention that resulted from these electoral dynamics created additional pressures while also providing opportunities to educate political leaders about the cultural and environmental issues that their work addressed. The financial warfare that territorial development interests initiated against the ranch included attempts to manipulate credit markets, interfere with shipping contracts, and create artificial shortages of essential supplies that would force economic dependence on hostile business networks. The economic independence that Sarah had achieved through innovative ranch management made her less vulnerable to such pressures than many frontier operations, but the systematic nature of the opposition required constant vigilance and creative responses to maintain operational viability. The economic success that the ranch continued to achieve despite these pressures demonstrated the practical advantages of integrating traditional knowledge with conventional business practices. The social ostracism that some community members attempted to impose on families associated with the ranch reflected broader cultural tensions about the appropriate boundaries between settler and indigenous communities. The success of cross-cultural education and healing programs threatened established social hierarchies while also challenging assumptions about cultural superiority that many settlers used to justify their displacement of indigenous peoples. The community support that the ranch continued to receive from families who had directly benefited from their services provided crucial protection against isolation while also demonstrating the practical value of their cultural bridge-building efforts. The autumn of 1893 marked the period when Sarah's abilities reached their full maturation, revealing the complete scope of powers that her spiritual transformation had unlocked while also demonstrating her mastery of the cultural responsibilities and ethical obligations that governed authentic traditional practice. The woman who had begun as an isolated widow struggling for survival had evolved into a spiritual practitioner whose influence extended throughout the Pacific Northwest region, bridging cultural divides and advancing understanding of human relationships with natural environments in ways that would continue shaping regional development for generations to come. The weather control capabilities that Sarah had developed through months of dedicated spiritual practice achieved levels of precision and scope that amazed even Joseph Running Bear, whose lifetime of traditional knowledge provided the cultural foundation for her abilities. Her whale prayer ceremonies could now influence atmospheric conditions across the entire Olympic Peninsula, creating protective weather patterns that shielded multiple communities from natural disasters, while maintaining the ecological balance necessary for environmental sustainability. The regional weather systems that responded to her spiritual interventions demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of atmospheric dynamics that traditional indigenous knowledge had achieved through centuries of careful observation and spiritual practice. Dr. Catherine Wells's comprehensive documentation of Sarah's healing abilities revealed therapeutic capabilities that went far beyond the emergency medical treatments that had initially attracted the physician's attention. Sarah's intuitive diagnosis could identify health problems at cellular levels before symptoms became apparent through conventional examination, while her energy healing techniques achieved therapeutic results that contemporary medicine could not match. The integration of traditional herbal knowledge with spiritual healing practices created medical approaches that addressed both physical symptoms and the underlying energetic imbalances that traditional medicine recognized as the root causes of illness. The environmental awareness that Sarah had developed through her spiritual connection to oceanic forces provided insights into ecological systems that enabled her to serve as an early warning system for environmental threats throughout the region. Her ability to sense pollution sources, predict ecosystem changes, and detect resource depletion years before conventional science would recognize these problems positioned her as a crucial advocate for environmental protection during a period when industrial development was beginning to threaten the natural systems that sustained both indigenous communities and frontier settlements. The cultural preservation work that had become central to Sarah's mission achieved remarkable success in documenting and protecting traditional Makah knowledge during a period when governmental policies were systematically attempting to suppress indigenous cultural practices. Her collaboration with Joseph Running Bear created comprehensive archives of spiritual traditions, ecological knowledge, and cultural practices that would prove invaluable for cultural survival during subsequent decades of forced assimilation policies. The preservation efforts also enabled broader understanding of indigenous knowledge systems among settler communities while maintaining appropriate respect for cultural boundaries and intellectual property rights. The educational programs that Sarah developed at Windward Ridge Ranch created unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural learning that benefited both settler and indigenous communities, while establishing models for respectful cultural exchange that could be replicated throughout the territory. Her teaching methods, refined through months of collaboration with Joseph Running Bear and validated by Dr. Wells's scientific observations, enabled other individuals to develop enhanced environmental sensitivity while maintaining appropriate respect for the indigenous origins of the practices they were learning. The educational initiatives attracted students from throughout the Pacific Northwest region and beyond. The technological innovations that emerged from Sarah's synthesis of traditional knowledge with frontier engineering created practical applications that improved life for frontier communities while demonstrating the potential for indigenous wisdom to contribute to technological development. Her weather prediction methods achieved accuracy levels that surpassed territorial meteorological services, while her agricultural techniques created farming approaches that maximize productivity while enhancing rather than depleting soil fertility. The construction methods she developed for buildings that could withstand supernatural weather conditions provided models for frontier architecture that balanced environmental harmony with practical functionality. The international recognition that Sarah's work attracted brought scholarly attention from universities and research institutions throughout North America and Europe, establishing her as a significant figure in emerging fields of environmental science and consciousness studies. The scientific expeditions that visited Windward Ridge Ranch documented her abilities while also providing academic validation for the traditional knowledge systems that sustained them. The scholarly publications that resulted from these studies contributed to growing academic interest in indigenous knowledge, while establishing scientific credibility for approaches that had previously been dismissed as primitive superstition. The spiritual authority that Sarah achieved within traditional Makah cultural structures represented an unprecedented honor for someone born outside the indigenous community, reflecting recognition of her authentic spiritual development and her commitment to cultural preservation and environmental protection. Joseph Running Bear's formal acknowledgement of her spiritual status within tribal traditions provided cultural legitimacy that protected her from accusations of appropriation, while also establishing her authority to teach simplified versions of traditional practices to other settlers who sought to develop more harmonious relationships with natural environments. The regional transformation that resulted from Sarah's influence extended far beyond weather protection to include changes in agricultural practices, environmental policies, and cultural relationships that would continue shaping Pacific Northwest development for decades to come. Her demonstration that traditional and conventional knowledge systems could be integrated beneficially challenged assumptions about cultural hierarchy and technological progress that had previously guided territorial development policies. The success of her collaborative approaches inspired similar partnerships throughout the region while establishing new models for cross-cultural cooperation. The medical revolution that Dr. Wells and Sarah initiated through their integrative healthcare approaches began influencing territorial medical practice as word spread of their therapeutic successes with conditions that conventional medicine had been unable to treat effectively. Their combination of traditional healing methods with contemporary medical knowledge created treatment protocols that addressed health problems from multiple perspectives while achieving results that neither approach could provide independently. The medical training programs they developed attracted practitioners from throughout the territory who sought to learn integrative approaches that could improve their therapeutic effectiveness. The economic independence that Sarah achieved through innovative ranch management enabled her to maintain complete autonomy in her spiritual and cultural work, while also providing resources for supporting the expanding educational and preservation initiatives that had become central to her mission. Her ability to predict market conditions and environmental factors that affected agricultural productivity created consistent profitability that freed her from dependence on potentially hostile business networks. The economic success of her operations demonstrated the practical advantages of integrating traditional ecological knowledge with conventional business practices. The environmental monitoring network that Sarah established through her enhanced spiritual sensitivity provided early detection of ecological threats that enabled protective measures to be implemented before irreversible damage occurred. Her observations of pollution sources, wildlife population changes, and ecosystem disruptions created comprehensive environmental data that influenced territorial policies toward industrial development and resource management. The environmental advocacy that resulted from her monitoring work would eventually contribute to some of the earliest environmental protection legislation in the Pacific Northwest region. The political influence that Sarah exercised through her cultural bridge building and environmental advocacy activities enabled her to advance policies that protected both indigenous communities and natural environments while also improving conditions for frontier settlements throughout the territory. Her careful neutrality in partisan politics, combined with her demonstrated expertise in environmental and cultural matters, positioned her as a respected advisor to territorial officials who sought practical solutions to complex policy challenges. The political relationship she developed would prove crucial for protecting her work from hostile interests while also advancing broader reforms. The spiritual legacy that Sarah created through her authentic practice of traditional whale prayers and her commitment to cultural preservation established foundations for the cultural revival movements that would emerge in subsequent generations. When indigenous communities regained political autonomy and cultural freedom. Her documentation of traditional practices and her demonstration of their continued relevance for environmental challenges provided resources that would prove invaluable during periods when indigenous knowledge was actively suppressed by governmental policies. The spiritual authority she achieved within traditional structures also established precedents for cross-cultural, spiritual exchange that would influence future relationships between settler and indigenous communities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.